He's nationally known and has been for several years because of his writings, lectures, film productions, and debates. His reputation is based on solid and extensive accomplishment. At the age of 15, for example, he won a national oratorical contest sponsored by the Hearst newspaper. He's had his own national network radio program, and for a time he served as assistant TV director at station WWJ-TV in Detroit. Within the past few years, he has completed 2 major books and has a new one to be published soon. He has written and produced numerous film strips and a series of radio programs on topical subjects. At present, he heads up American Media, which is a publishing and audiovisual production company located here in Southern California. And so, you'll want to hear this man. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to present Mr. G. Edward Griffin, and his subject will be the United Nations. Ed?
Thank you, Ron, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here tonight, in a very real sense, as a salesman. I have an idea to sell. The idea is that the United States should disengage from the United Nations. Most people in this country find that very hard to buy, and one has to be a pretty good salesman to sell that idea. In fact, it reminds me of the story of the super salesman that thought he could sell anything, and he applied for a job in a clothing store, and the manager told him he could have the job on condition that he could sell a certain impossible suit. They'd had that suit out there in the racks for 5 years and couldn't sell it. And this fellow thought he could sell anything, so he said, all right, I'll take the job on that condition. And he tried his best, but he could not sell that suit. It was a dandy. Finally, as the days wore on, it was Friday, the end of the week, and he had failed, and it looked as though he was going to have to admit defeat. But then, just before closing time, on Friday afternoon, he walked into the manager's office, which is in the back of the store, with a big grin on his face. He said, I sold the suit! I sold the suit! And the manager looked at him in surprise because the poor fellow was all disheveled. His clothes were torn, his hair was all messed up, his face was bleeding, one of his shoes was missing. And the manager said, good grief, what happened? He said, I sold the suit. The customer was easy, but that seeing eye dog was really rough. Sometimes that's how I feel when I'm trying to sell this idea. But actually, when you think about it, the idea that I'm here to sell is not quite that hard. Because unlike this impossible suit, the concept that we should disengage from the United Nations has a great deal of obvious merit. But the real problem is first to unsell an idea. And that idea is that the UN is our last best hope for peace, which means that we have to tangle with all of these self-appointed seeing-eye dogs in our midst who have been leading the blinded American public for about 30 years. I should tell you that I haven't always been opposed to the United Nations. I went through the same brain laundries as everyone else, and I came out the other end firmly convinced that it was our last best hope for peace, and that at least while you're talking, you're not shooting and all of these other things that we hear. And it took quite a while, quite a bit of research and reflective thought before I changed my position. I should tell you also that I haven't abandoned the dream or the ideal of a world united in peace and brotherhood. I still think that someday this is inevitable for mankind and a desirable goal. But ladies and gentlemen, we must separate out in our minds the difference between some United Nations or a possible United Nations or an ideal United Nations or a future United Nations and the existing United Nations. There's quite a difference. And when we get that straight in our minds, then we're able to grapple with the problem of whether or not we should disengage from the existing UN. I'm a firm believer in the old adage that when in making a public presentation of this kind, first you should tell them what you're going to tell them, then you should tell them, and then you should tell them what you told them. I've always appreciated that approach when other speakers have used it, and so I'm going to try and follow that this time. The case against the United Nations can be summarized in 4 very succinct points. I'm going to list those points in outline form now, and this is what I'm going to tell you. First of all, we face reality number one, which is that the United Nations is destructive of human rights. Two, the United Nations creates conditions that lead to war. Three, if allowed to continue, the United Nations will develop into a world socialist dictatorship. And four, the final control of that dictatorship inevitably will come to rest in the hands of international communism. Now that's what I'm going to tell you. And I think you will agree with me, regardless of whether you think that these points are valid. I think you will agree, however, that these charges are not only shocking or should be shocking to many people, but that they are extremely serious. And that if even one of these points can be demonstrated to be true, that one alone would be justification enough for the United States disengaging from the United Nations. So let's take a look at the evidence on all four of these realities. I started off by saying that the United Nations is destructive of human rights. Now, doesn't that sound strange? Because today, all we hear about the United Nations is that it is very much concerned about human rights. The official pronouncements coming from that group almost always speak of great concern and respect for the rights of man. And so we just know that the United Nations is concerned over human rights because they tell us so endlessly. And yet I have the audacity to stand here and say something to the contrary. In order to understand why I take this position, I'd like to prepare the groundwork by recalling that beautiful little allegory by George Orwell entitled Animal Farm, because this will set the stage for a proper understanding of the UN approach to human rights. As you recall, Orwell depicted a community of animals on Farmer Jones' place. And the animals became very upset because they were convinced that Farmer Jones was exploiting them. I mean, after all, they were the workers. They did all the work. The horse pulled the plow, the chickens laid the eggs, but it was Farmer Jones that lived in a nice big house and slept in a bed and wore fine clothes and enjoyed all the profits of their toil. And so they decided that he was exploiting them. Now, they also decided, therefore, to overthrow his regime. They were going to have a revolution. And as you know, in any revolution, you have to have leaders. Now, the pigs volunteered that leadership. The pigs called the animals together in the barnyard out behind the barn. And they had gotten a ladder and a can of paint. And with very crude brush strokes, because it's very hard for a pig to hold the paintbrush between his hoofed claws, they got up on the ladder and they painted on the back of the barn, in big letters for everyone to see, certain great political principles of the revolution. The rights of the animals, emblazoned right there for everyone to see and remember. Some of those political principles were as follows. No animal shall drink alcoholic beverages. No animal shall sleep in a bed. No animal shall kill another animal. But the greatest of all of the political principles was the last, which read, all animals are equal. And these were the principles that fired their imagination and brought forth their revolutionary zeal. And it drove them on to a successful revolution. They overthrew Farmer Jones and drove him from the farm. And the animals took over. It was a workers' paradise. Or so they thought. As the story progressed, strange things began to happen. The fences fell down. Nobody knew how to fix them. The windmill broke. Nobody knew how to fix it. There was a leak in the roof of the barn. Didn't get fixed. The weeds started to come up through the crops, and the crops failed. And the first thing you know, the workers were working harder and longer than they ever did before and living less well. And some of them even began to long for the good old days when they were exploited by Farmer Jones. And the lot of the animals was very bad indeed. except for the pigs. And they live very well. As a matter of fact, the pigs, being the leaders of the new workers' paradise, had moved into Farmer Jones' house. And some of the other animals had peeked in the windows, and you know what they saw? Well, they saw the pigs standing upright. They had learned to walk around on their hind legs, and they were wearing clothes and parading in front of mirrors. And those pigs were drinking alcoholic beverages, and they were sleeping in Farmer Jones' bed. And when some of the animals didn't want to go along with this new revolutionary regime, the pigs had them executed. And the animals were despondent. They didn't understand, how could this actually happen? Remember those great political principles? And so one afternoon late, they gathered out behind the barn to see if there weren't something in those principles there which they could point to and say, look, you can't do this. It's against the rules. And when they got there, an interesting thing had happened. The letters by now were faded, but it was clear that some new letters had been added. Some words had been added at the ends of these old political principles. You could tell because the paint was more fresh. And as the animals tried to make out the words, here is what they now found. No animal shall drink alcoholic beverages to excess. No animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets. No animal shall kill another animal without cause. And the greatest of all political principles now read, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. So there, in a nutshell, Orwell has presented for all to see the universal device of all collectivist demagoguery. And that is the device of using high-sounding phrases and appealing to the noble aspirations of well-intentioned but unenlightened followers. Now, we can see this principle being applied in the 20th century very clearly. As everyone knows who has studied Marxism at the university or in high school, any textbook on the subject, we all know that the Marxists say that the great political principle on the back of their barn is as follows: from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Now, everyone knows that. We've heard it over and over again. It's interesting, therefore, to take this great political principle, which was used before the Revolution, and see how it actually was written on the back of the barn after the Revolution was a success. And here's the back of the barn. What I'm holding is the Constitution of the Soviet Union. Article 12 reads as follows, quote, work in the USSR is a duty and a matter of honor for every able-bodied citizen, in accordance with the principle, he who does not work, neither shall he eat. The principle applied in the USSR is that of socialism, from each according to his ability, to each according to his work, end quote. Interesting switch, wouldn't you say? I would venture that not one communist out of 100 in the United States, or one Marxist out of 1,000, understands that there has been a switch made on the back of the barn in the Soviet Union and in all other so-called socialist countries. Now, elsewhere in the Soviet Constitution, Article 124 speaks of freedom of religion. That's right, freedom of religion guaranteed in the Soviet Union. However, Article 122 of the Soviet Penal Code makes it a crime to teach religion to children. In other words, you've got a freedom of religion there, except as may be provided by law, and they have such a law. Article 103 says, quote, in all courts, cases are tried with the participation of juries, except in cases specially provided for by law. Article 111 says, in all courts of the USSR, cases are heard in public, unless otherwise provided by law. Now, what a far cry that is from the traditional American concept built into our own Bill of Rights. Congress shall pass no law abridging our right of freedom of speech, peaceful assembly, the right to bear arms, and so forth. Congress shall pass no law, not except as may be provided for by law. Now, there aren't very many words difference, just a few little words. But oh, what a world of difference they make. Now, this same gimmick, except as may be provided for by law, is at the heart of all of the UN concepts of human rights. I believe that if the average American would read these covenants on human rights and all these wonderful documents that the UN is always publishing, if they would read them with just half as much care as they would read a used car sales contract, they would never sign them. Never. Because they're so full of obvious loopholes. Now, this document here is the draft covenant on human rights put out by the United Nations. I'll read just a few excerpts to you. Article 10. The right of everyone to form trade unions and join the trade union of his choice is guaranteed. No restrictions may be placed on the exercise of this right, other than those prescribed by law. Article 27. No one shall be deprived of his liberty, except on such grounds and in accordance with such procedure as are established by law. Article 30. Everyone shall have the right to liberty of movement and freedom to choose his residence. The above-mentioned rights shall not be subject to any restrictions except those which are provided by law. Article 36. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law. Gets monotonous after a while, but here are a few more. Article 37. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds. The exercise of the rights provided for in the foregoing paragraph carries with it certain duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall be such only as are provided by law. Every one of the basic concepts of human rights are couched in that kind of terminology. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very important issue. But let's not stretch it beyond its usefulness, because after all, even in the most free society, it's impossible to have absolute freedom for everyone. It's logical to limit the freedoms of each person at that point where those freedoms could be used to take away the freedoms of someone else. For instance, if a man is duly convicted of a crime, it isn't logical to allow him freedom to run around the streets. We can't allow freedom for someone to stand up in a crowded theater and yell fire and that sort of thing. There is a logical limit to liberty, and when we place those limits on liberty, we do have to codify them in law. So let's not stretch this point beyond its usefulness. It is extremely important from the philosophical point of view because it orients us philosophically on a very important question of rights. But more important than the actual words is the concept of the origin of those rights. Now, to some, what I'm about to say may sound like a religious dissertation, but I can assure you it is not. The thoughts I would like to offer now have a very practical political bearing on our lives. Human rights must be conceived as coming from one of two places. Either they come from a divine source, they are God-given rights, or they are not, in which case then they must be assumed to come from the state, from government itself. Now, in the traditional American concept, before the Supreme Court got to work on it, it was assumed by our founding fathers that man's rights came from God, and they said so. They called our rights inalienable rights, which meant that man could not tamper with them. He had nothing to do with them. They were inalienable. And therefore, the government which they created had a primary responsibility of safeguarding those God-granted rights. And hence that was the purpose of the Bill of Rights. On the other hand, those who hold the view that rights do not come from God, therefore they come from the state, these people have a rather interesting dilemma on their hands. Because if you assume that the government can grant rights, then you have to assume that they also have the power to take them away. You can't have one without the other. And I don't think that very many Americans would want to accept that corollary if they gave it a moment's thought. It is no coincidence or accident that in the Soviet Union and in all communist countries, it is boldly asserted that rights come from the state, and hence they can take them away any time they wish, through law or any other means. It is also no accident or coincidence that in the United Nations, this same concept is embodied. Article 6 of the Draft Covenant on Human Rights says, "The states parties to this covenant recognize that in the enjoyment of those rights provided by the state," they come right out and say so, "those rights provided by the state, the state may subject such rights only to such limitations as are deemed by law." And we're back to that again. And why not? They can give you your rights, they certainly can take them away any time they wish. All right, enough for the theory. This is very theoretical, some will say, and it's true, it is. Forget the words and the parchments and all the phrases, and let's take a look for a moment at what the United Nations actually has done in the area of human rights. And then we can judge how sincere they are when they speak about this matter. We already have in the record one clear case history of UN violation of human rights, and that is in the so-called peacekeeping operation of the United Nations in the Congo from 1960 through 1963. What I'm about to relate to you is the story of that so-called peacekeeping operation, and I would like to tell you that it comes not from sources that are hostile to the UN, but from sources that are part of the United Nations itself. Everything I'm about to tell you is right in the UN record, or in the books written by UN personnel who participated in that operation, and most of whom boasted of it. Now here's the story in a nutshell. The Congo was granted its independence in 1960 from Belgium. Immediately, the entire area was plunged into chaos, anarchy, revolution. This was a result primarily of communist agitation to bring about this precise result under the leadership of Patrice Lumumba, who was at that time the elected head of the Central Congolese government, the new independent state. Patrice Lumumba was a communist, although at the time he said he was not. That's standard operational procedure. There was one province in Katanga, however, which decided not to have any of this chaos, and that was the province of Katanga. Under the leadership of Moise Tshombe, who was very pro-Western, pro-American, and very anti-communist, he seceded from the rest of the Congo in accordance with the UN Charter and in accordance with Article 1 of the Draft Covenant on Human Rights, both of which guarantee to all peoples the right of self-determination. And so, acting on these nice high-sounding phrases from the UN, Katanga seceded and called for its rights to self-determination. And the UN said no. They threw out all the communist agitators there. They retained the Belgian officers who had been in charge of their local police force, and had these men, just a handful of them, provide the leadership and the training for the Katangese army, which was made up predominantly of Katangese themselves. And the United Nations charged that these Belgians who were retained were mercenaries, and the mercenaries must go. What do you suppose the United Nations troops were? If those weren't mercenaries, there's no definition for that word. And so, under this leadership of Moise Tshombe, Katanga restored law and order, and it sat there like an island, a paradise of tranquility, in a frothing sea of anarchy around it. And many eyewitness accounts attested to this, including newspaper people from all around the world. At this stage in the game, Patrice Lumumba called upon the United Nations to send troops, called peacekeeping troops, to restore peace, to restore law and order. You see, there was chaos there because Lumumba wanted it, but now he was calling in the UN troops to restore law and order, to solve the problem he created. It's a standard political trick, create problems so that you can provide your own brand of solutions. Reminds me of the story of the three men. One was a surgeon, one was an engineer, and one was a politician. And they were talking together about which of their professions was the oldest. And the surgeon said that his was the oldest, no doubt, because, as everyone knew, Eve was made out of one of Adam's ribs, and that was a surgical procedure. And the engineer said, no, that's not the oldest profession, because prior to that, the world was created in 6 days out of chaos, and that must have been a tremendous engineering feat. And the politician spoke up and he said, yeah, but who do you suppose created all the chaos? Lumumba was playing this game, creating chaos so he could provide the solutions. So he called in the UN peacekeeping forces. And where did they go? Well, you guessed it. They did not go to those areas where they were needed, or a few troops went, but most of them went to the one province where they were not needed and were not wanted, the province of Katanga. And they went there for the sole purpose of smashing Katanga, bringing war to that peaceful province and forcing it back under the control of the central Congolese government, which in turn was totally controlled by communists. And their leaders, the United Nations leaders, even admitted that. They said, of course, we had to tell the rest of the world that we went there not to intervene in the internal affairs of Katanga, because, as everyone knows, that's against the principles of the UN Charter. So we had to say that. But then they admitted in their own books, but of course that's why we went. Why else would we go there? This book, entitled Soldiering for Peace, is written by Major General Karl Van Horn. Van Horn was the man who was in charge of that UN military operation. And on page 192, here's what he said, quote, having seen the chaos in the other 5 provinces that had followed the flight of the Belgians, it struck me as a little short of madness to contemplate disrupting a well-organized state like Katanga. I had always spoken frankly to Dag Hammarskjöld, and now I asked him whether he really believed it right to kick out every Belgian soldier and civil servant when we were incapable of bringing in replacements soon enough to prevent a total collapse of the civilian administration. I was unable to press this point because Dag became extremely angry. In an icy but controlled voice, he informed me that there was no alternative to expelling the Belgians. The following morning, our troops entered Katanga by air and rail. Now, here he was admitting that there was no need for them to be there. And all the while, UN personnel were telling the world that they were there to restore peace to the Congo. Now, when those troops went to Katanga, the Katangese told them they weren't wanted. But they didn't fight them. They didn't oppose them. They said, all right, if you're going to come, fine. We'll accept you as peaceful visitors. And in came all these troops into Katanga. And they insisted that the Belgian officers go. And Moise Chambé said, well, of course not, they're not going to go. If they went, we wouldn't be able to maintain our state. We'd be thrown into the same kind of anarchy as you find elsewhere in the Congo. No, we're not going to dismiss the heads of our army. So what did the peacekeepers do? Not once, but twice. They launched a surprise military attack against Katanga, unprovoked. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the peacekeepers brought war to the sleeping city of Elizabethville. And the citizens of that city woke up at 4:15 to the sound of UN jets screaming through the air, dropping bombs on hospitals, Red Cross stations, homes. They also heard the sound of machine gun fire in their streets and the thump of mortar fire. Unprovoked attack, ladies and gentlemen, in the name of peace. Not only did a war result, but the conduct of the United Nations was absolutely beyond belief. I mentioned the bombing of hospitals. that was nothing by comparison to what they did elsewhere. They deliberately destroyed churches. Their troops went up and down residential streets without any reason at all. They would go into one house after another and bayonet everyone that was in there, women, children in their beds, old women in the kitchens preparing meals. They would shoot at automobiles going through the streets, anything that moved, all in the name of peace. It's hard to believe that this actually happened. There are many books on the subject, eyewitness accounts. I'd like to mention just one, which is certainly very graphic. It's called 46 Angry Men. And this is a copy of it here. It contains photographs of the atrocities, the dismembered human beings, the destroyed hospitals, churches, automobiles, ambulances, the bayoneted women and children by UN troops. It's grotesque reading. It's written by the 46 civilian doctors of Elizabethville, who had no political axe to grind. In fact, most of these men were very pro-UN, and they couldn't believe their eyes. And at one point during the UN attack, they sent a telegram to all the leaders of the world. And in this telegram, you could just hear the amazement and the disbelief in their words, that they couldn't understand that their United Nations was doing this. The telegram read as follows: SOS to the moral conscience of the world. Implore you to intervene with all your authority to stop the terrorist bombardment of hospitals and civilian populations by United Nations. On our honor as physicians, we declare as lies the denials of UN Secretary General. We insist upon an inquiry here by high magistrates and presidents of medical orders of all civilized nations. Only means of convincing the world of inconceivable actions of UN, alas, dishonored. Insist upon creation of international tribune competent to judge the crimes and misdeeds of UN personnel who benefit from immunity contrary to natural law. Signed, the 46 civilian doctors of Elizabethville. But of course the UN denied it. They said they weren't perpetrating any atrocities. They were there to restore peace. And all of their official pronouncements were to that effect. Can you believe the official pronouncements of UN personnel? Well, I'll give you an idea. This book, entitled To Katanga and Back, was written by Connor Cruz O'Brien. O'Brien was the man who was directly underneath Dag Hammarskjöld, and he was really the man in charge of the entire political and military operation. He was giving orders to the military people in the Congo. And he wrote this book boasting about what he did there in the cause of peace. He's the one that admitted that, of course, they were there to intervene in the internal affairs of the Congo. Of course they were there, but they had to tell the people something. And on page 300, he is speaking about talking with newsmen, and he said, quote, I also referred them to an interview I had given Keith Kyle for the BBC. Chiari, by the way, was another UN administrator there in the Congo. Chiari, who was in Elizabethville at the time, asked whether it was an orthodox interview, and smiled the smile of a man who knows that all official versions have been from the beginning of time and forever will be worded to deceive the enemy and appease the clamor of the ignorant. End quote. And you might keep that in mind the next time you hear an official statement about the UN concern for human rights. Now, do you suppose that if the United Nations were granted the power that it seeks to enforce its edicts and to enforce these rights on everyone, do you suppose that I would be granted the right to stand up here and speak out against the United Nations? Or that you would be granted the right to sit in safety and listen to me? Would you assume that this is part of the human right to receive information of all kinds? Of course not. That would be called anti-UN propaganda. In spite of Article 19 of the Covenant, which guarantees freedom of expression, it also speaks of certain restrictions. Remember, like what? In 1961, during the height of the UN attack against Katanga, the New York Times ran an article describing this action, and it read as follows, quote, "Asked why a UN jet attacked the post office in Elizabethville with rockets yesterday, General McCune replied that the airstrike had been ordered because the building had been used to transmit anti-UN propaganda." End quote. No animal shall kill another animal without cause. And so I repeat, reality number one. Both from the standpoint of theory and in actual practice, the United Nations is destructive of human rights. So let's move now to reality number two. I said that the United Nations creates conditions that lead to war. Now here again we have a direct contradiction between my statement and all of the official pronouncements from the UN. Well, we all know that the UN is our last best hope for peace. How can I say it's a cause of war? Let us first ask ourselves, what are the causes of war? Now, the United Nations tells us that the causes of war are poverty, ignorance, or lack of diplomatic contact. Let's take a quick look at those statements. War caused by poverty. Ladies and gentlemen, can you think of a single war of history that was started by a poverty-stricken nation? Of course not. Wars are started by industrialized nations, powerful nations, nations which can support the war effort successfully that they're beginning. What about ignorance? Is that a cause of war? Well, can you think of any war of history that was started by men who were ignorant? The leaders of these countries, these are the ones that make the decisions, you know. Were they ignorant? They certainly were not. And in our own century, the greatest wars that we can think of involve the most educated and advanced nations. It's obvious that ignorance is not a cause of war. What about lack of diplomatic contact, lack of talking between diplomats? Really? Have we forgotten already that when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, at that very time, their ambassador was in Washington talking to our diplomatic people? Diplomatic contact can be used to distract. You get people talking and you can distract with one hand while you prepare to strike with the other. And just mere talking and contact has nothing to do with the cause of war. So let's dismiss those myths. What does cause war? I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that the cause of war between nations is exactly the same cause of a fist fight in your backyard. The basic element is human nature. The only difference is the number of people involved. So to answer this question, let's do what the sociologists always like to do, and let's take three people and put them on a desert island and analyze that basic element of society and determine certain truths. And then perhaps we can understand how these truths apply to the interaction between larger numbers of people. Let's assume that you and I and one other person are on a desert island, and the question before us then is, what is it that would cause you or me or the other fellow to raise our hand and strike the other person? I suggest that you might fight if I or the other fellow ganged up on you and tried to take your food from you against your will, especially if the food supply were short. I think you might fight if we ganged up on you and tried to kick you out of your shelter, which you had built with your own hands, especially if you needed that shelter to protect you from the elements. I think you might fight if we tried to gang up on you and take from you your freedom, make you our slave, force you to work for us. And I think you might fight if we constantly irritated you and condemned you and criticized your habits and your beliefs. So we have a situation then where a man logically would fight to protect his life, his liberty, and his property, and also likely could be sparked into a fight if he were constantly condemned and angered. The key to peace, then, between the three of us on this island is for us to respect each other, to respect our idiosyncrasies, especially, to mind our own business as much as possible, to have a great deal of tolerance and compassion, but not to force anyone to do anything. Not to use force to take from anyone their life, their liberty, or their property. Now, if we want them to give up some property to someone else voluntarily, we should try to persuade them through argument and especially through example. But we should use no force at all if we want to remain at peace. The only time we would be justified in using force would be in our own negative self-defense. Now, let's suppose that all three of us decided that we wanted to federate. We thought it would be a good idea to get on a big flat rock, and we're now going to form the United Men. And so we get together and we design a flag. And now we've got a flag. And we get some paper, and we write across the top of the piece of paper the word charter. And we write some words down there as to our great political principles, right? And then we get a whole big stack of paper, and we start writing down things that we agree to do between us. And then we get a big rubber stamp that says law, and we start stamping that on the tops and on the bottoms of those pieces of paper. Now, does this make any difference? I don't think it would. We could put words on pieces of paper till we were blue in the face. We could erect marble buildings with all kinds of curlicues on the tops of the pillars. We could have courtrooms draped in red velvet and rich mahogany paneling. We could have flags, we could have trumpets, we could have ceremonies, and it wouldn't make a bit of difference, because the minute that two of us tried to gang up on the other guy and take from him his life, his liberty, or his property, or to condemn him endlessly, he would still fight. And the basic underlying principles are the same. These are the principles that enforce peace, and the violation of those principles are the cause of war. With that in mind, then, let's take a look at how the United Nations approaches the question of peace and war. The April 25th, 1966 issue of U.S. News and World Report had an article about the United Nations, and I'd like to read to you a brief extract from it. It said, quote, "Britain, in the name of the United Nations, is using armed force, a naval blockade, to bring down the government of Rhodesia, a nation at peace." Well, the question is this: was that an act that was in the cause of peace, or was it an act which led toward war? At the United Nations, we have something called diplomacy on the stage. The idea there is that the best way to solve all the problems between nations is to get all of their delegates together in a big room. And then if some nation has a grievance, it gets up on the stage in front of a microphone and it starts to condemn the other nation against whom they have the grievance. And then it's the other nation's turn to defend itself and condemn the first representative. Imagine that a man and his wife had an argument. And in an effort to resolve this argument, they decided that the best thing was to go out on the front porch and set up a microphone and then put folding chairs on the lawn and call in all their relatives and friends and begin to present their case. Now, here's what would happen. The woman would stand up there and she would take about 5 or 10 minutes or longer and explain in detail what a cad and a louse he was. And then it was his turn. And he would stand up and he would make it very clear that all the injury was not on one side alone. And this would go back and forth, back and forth. Finally, each of them has to exaggerate their case and save face and make points. Are they going to solve their problem that way? Hardly. Not only that, but after they're through with their debates, it comes time now for a vote. That's the reason everyone was called there. When the vote comes, you know what happens. All the women vote in favor of the housewife, and all the men vote in favor of the husband. So the problem really hasn't been solved, and now all of these people go home, and there are arguments not only that, but after they're through with their debates, it comes time now for a vote. That's the reason everyone was called there. When the vote comes, you know what happens. All the women vote in favor of the housewife, and all the men vote in favor of the husband. So the problem really hasn't been solved, and now all of these people go home, and there are arguments going on in every living room in the whole community. It's true. What should have been a problem between one couple now has infected the whole community. This is exactly what happens between nations. At the United Nations, they think they're going to solve problems by hurling insults at each other. And then it comes time to vote, and the entire world is forced to choose up sides on all of these issues. And I suggest that that is a step in the direction of friction, agitation, condemnation, and moving us closer to war than to peace. At the United Nations, the concept is not to allow people freedom to have their idiosyncrasies, but to force them all into a common mold. We will tell them what kind of a legal system to have, what kind of mores to have. And if you don't go along with that, well, then we'll have to call in the peacekeepers. And I say that when a group of nations at the United Nations can gang up and enforce a trade embargo against Rhodesia, or wage a military campaign against Katanga, it is a farce to speak of peace, for these are the acts of war. And so I repeat, reality number two, the United Nations creates conditions that lead directly to war. Let's move on then to reality number three. I said that the United Nations, if allowed to continue, will develop into a world socialist dictatorship. At the United Nations, the bedrock of world socialism or collectivism is found in Articles 55 and 56 of the Charter. Article 56 reads, quote, "All members pledge themselves to take joint and separate action for the achievement of the purposes set forth in Article 55. And what are those? Article 55 lists them as follows: higher standards of living, full employment, economic and social progress, health, and related problems, which covers everything. The sky's the limit. If you can think of anything that isn't related to one of those, you win the Cupidon. Well, what's the result of this carte blanche concept? The result is a collectivist's paradise. Did you ever wonder what goes on in that big building down on the East River with that upright obelisk with all of the fluorescent tubes that stay lit all night long? I get the mental impression of a great beehive there just teeming with thousands of these international servants working day in and day out, and indeed they do, cranking out these endless miles of reports and findings and studies, doing the groundwork now upon which the laws will be based as soon as they can enforce those laws with a permanent UN army. Daily reports on such things as setting prices, production quotas, national inventories and stockpiles of raw materials, labor standards, wages and monetary policies, tariffs, employment levels, population movements, birth control, nutritional standards, health care, retirement, educational standards, nursery care, and believe it or not, even standards for garbage collection. The collectivist goal for the United Nations is a world forum, a world legislature, a world Department of Education, a World Welfare Agency, a World Planning Center for Industry and Commerce, a world banking system. And if we don't stop this whole thing very shortly, you're going to see that develop quickly in the very near future. A world banking system supposedly being offered to solve the problems or the chaos in our own banking system. And believe me when I tell you that's the same tactic of creating chaos and problems for the sole reason so that the politicians can supply the solution. A world treasury based upon that world banking system. A world currency backed by something called paper gold. which means, of course, paper. A world police force, and a world anything else that anyone might want, or to be more specific, that anyone might not want. I mentioned a world army. It's important for us to know that this concept of a standing military force is not being forced on the leadership of America. It is their idea, always has been. You should know, for instance, that as long ago as 1950, when Richard Nixon was a member of Congress, he submitted a proposal to Congress calling for a standing permanent UN army which would be able to move into action upon the majority vote at the UN. Of course, this concept has been backed by every American president. Vista magazine, which I'm holding here, is published by the American Association for the United Nations. This particular issue is January-February 1968. It contains an article by Mary Kersey Harvey, who is one of the senior editors of McCall magazine. In this article, she describes an interview which she had with former President Eisenhower. And in this interview, she and he were discussing the concept of a standing permanent UN army. And then she said as follows, quote, "The President studied the above plan quickly, and as I had expected, he caught the ball and ran with it. You'd have, he began to plan out loud, world marshals, comparable to our own U.S. marshals, backed by armed forces. Non-compliance with UN law, and you send in the UN forces. And, too," he hammered away, "the UN needs nuclear power." He bore down hard on the word nuclear. "Take this example," he hurried on. "You have two countries in a border argument. The UN orders the matter to be taken to the International Court. One or both of the disputants refuses to submit to compulsory arbitration. The UN, which by now has in its possession a fleet of submarines armed with nuclear missiles deployed around the world, orders one of the submarines to proceed to the area. The world is then told that if firing breaks out for any reason whatsoever, a tactical nuclear weapon will be delivered onto the disputed territory. If this threat fails to prevent armed conflict, you back it up with action." End quote. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our last best hope for peace. You see, these people are not so concerned about the atomic bomb being dropped. They're only concerned about who's going to drop it. They don't want nations dropping it, but they're perfectly willing to foresee a situation where the United Nations could drop it. You should know, too, that according to this international court, the World Court, they have already handed down a decision which says that it is impossible, by definition, for the United Nations to wage war. Regardless of how many atomic bombs are dropped, regardless of how many troops are deployed, regardless of how many lives are snuffed out, how many buildings are destroyed, by definition, that shall be called a peacekeeping operation, says the UN World Court. Consider the prospects of a UN tax. If we're going to have a world government, and many people seem to be most anxious to have one, obviously we've got to have a tax to support that government. And the people at the UN are getting most impatient with all of this voluntary contribution business. They're getting itchy for a permanent tax. What kind of a tax do you suppose it's going to be? Did you ever think about it? Well, you'd better think about it. What kind do we have in the United States to support our federal government? Something called a progressive income tax. And we seem to think that's fair in this country, in keeping with that wonderful principle, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. We have bought it for ourselves, nobody complains. Would we have any basis for complaint, therefore, if the United Nations were to adopt such a system in their tax? Obviously not. Would the United Nations be likely to adopt such a tax And the answer is obviously yes. Most of the nations at the United Nations have such a tax. First of all, we must understand that if you take away Great Britain, Russia, and France, and you add up the gross national products of all the other nations at the UN combined, they add up to less than that of the United States of America. So we might say that we come in rather at the top of the progressive tax concept. Now, in this country, as you know, we have sat still for those who can afford it in accordance with their ability to be taxed 60%, 70%, 80%, 85% of their incomes. Is it possible that the majority of the nations of the world who are going to write the tax through the democratic process, they being so poor by comparison to us, is it possible that they would decide to write a tax which would confiscate from the American people 80% of their gross national product to support the rest of the world which needs it so much? You'd better believe it. That is exactly what is going to happen. What possibly could stop the development of a socialist dictatorship at the UN? Will it be the Charter? As we have already seen, the Charter demands it. Will it be the Declaration of Human Rights? As we have already seen, the Declaration ignores it and permits it. Will it be the moral conscience of the world? Is that going to prevent a socialist dictatorship? Certainly not, because most of these countries are themselves socialist dictatorships, and they can only create at the United Nations what they represent at home. Let's assume, however, just for the sake of argument, that all of these leaders of these countries are noble men. I think we'd still have the same problem on our hands. So often we hear, but seem never to heed, that wonderful dictum by Lord Acton, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." If that concept is true, then consider the corruptibility of the men, these angels at the United Nations, once they have absolute power in their hands. And by that I mean a monopoly over all of the police forces, all of the military might, the armies, the navies, the Air Force, and all of the atomic weapons. That is a tremendous concentration of power, the likes of which the world has never seen before. Could mere mortal men withstand the temptation of such power? I think not, ladies and gentlemen. Even if they were all wonderful men, responding to the most noble aspirations for mankind, in time they would yield. Or in time they would be replaced by somebody else. They can't live forever. And with a constant turnover of new political figures coming in, it's just a question of time before this absolute power would fall into the hands of men who are very corruptible. But that's looking at the brighter side of the issue. That's assuming that they're all angels there today, which of course they are not, just the reverse. Which leads me now to my fourth and final reality, which is that the ultimate control of this world dictatorship will come to rest inevitably in the hands of international communism. Now, I used to talk a great deal about the communist control over the United Nations way back in 1961, 1962, primarily because people didn't believe it. It took a tremendous amount of convincing. You talk about having to be a super salesman. You really had to do it then. But now it's not so difficult because the communist influence and control at the United Nations is becoming increasingly obvious. And it became very obvious to a large number of Americans when they turned on their television sets and saw the anti-American glee on the faces of all those delegates on the day that nationalist China was kicked out of the Security Council and Red China brought in. People now, even though they may not be aware of the details and the documentation, instinctively they know about communist influence and control at the UN. But let's not ignore the question, because it is important. How much do they actually control? Let's start by looking at the number of communists who go to the UN among the delegates and the Secretariat from communist countries. It's no surprise to anybody that the Soviet Union sends communists to the UN. Now, do they control it? Of course not. That group is very small. So if we're going to prove that they control the UN, we're going to have to look elsewhere. So let's take a look at the non-communist nations. Is it possible that communists go to the UN from non-communist nations? Well, of course, even though many people haven't considered that possibility. You see, in many nations, the Communist Party is treated as though it were a political party. Consequently, in these countries, communists are on the ballot, and some of them are elected to office. And this happens even in the more militant anti-communist nations of the world. Take a look at the NATO alliance, for instance, the great bulwark against communism, so-called. In Italy, Communist Party is the second largest party there. In France, Communist Party is the second largest political party in France, which means that open and admitted members of the Communist Party hold the second largest number of seats in the French Parliament. And they hold jobs in the French government, and they go to the United Nations. And so it's a matter of record that many of these people from non-communist nations are communists. That still doesn't quite add up to total control. What about the possibility of communists who are not known to be communists? Is that possible? Well, I think it is, especially in view of the fact that all of the communist training manuals on this subject say that their primary objective in countries before they take over is to keep the larger part of the party underground. They admit this. They talk about it. They have training manuals on it. And former communists who have defected from the party have testified to this strategy. For every communist that is known to be a communist, they insist on at least 9 or 10 others who are not known. And these, they say, have got to be the ones in the more sensitive positions. Even after the takeover, when most of these people come up and surface and finally admit that they have been communists all along, they still keep about 10 to 20% of their numbers underground, just as a precaution against counter-revolution and underground activities against their own regimes. So we know that for every open communist at the United Nations, by the sheer process of logic, there has got to be at least an equal number, and perhaps more, communists who are not known. Now, how can we nail that one down? I think the best way to do that is to look at the record of the most militant anti-communist nation in the whole world and see how their house is in order. And that, of course, is the United States. If we can see how we have been faring on the question of secret communists at the UN, then we might be able to surmise what it's like among the quota from other countries. Back in 1964, when I completed the manuscript for my book on the UN called The Fearful Master, I listed 17 men who were American employees of the federal government who, according to the government documents, were key people in creating United Nations policies on behalf of our country. Now, you see, the United Nations was not put together in San Francisco in 1945. That was window dressing. The work had already been done, and it was done over the war years in Washington, D.C., primarily in our State Department, primarily in the particular division of our State Department under the heading of Alger Hiss, the Post-War Planning Division. And I listed 17 men who, according to documents of the State Department and the Treasury Department and others, were claimed to be our representatives cranking out this United Nations for us that finally was ratified in San Francisco in 1945. Now, since that time, further research has led me to believe that that number was perhaps premature. First of all, it's really impossible to say that this man was influential and that one was not. There are all kinds of variations and degrees. It probably was a mistake to put a hard and fast number on it in the first place, although I must say that I have never been called on this, and I've been waiting for it, but nobody has ever challenged that number. But I've come to believe since then that a more accurate figure perhaps would be 35. Okay? You take your choice of numbers, 17 or 35, But here's what you come up with. Out of that 17, if you want to take the smaller number, 13 of those men were since identified as members of the Communist Party, although they were unknown to be communists at the time. If you want to take the larger number of 35, the figure is still the same. 13 were identified as communists. 21 of that larger group were members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, and 3 of them were both communists and members of the CFR. Now, if you don't know what the CFR is, all I can do here is just open up the lid on that can of worms and let you take a peek inside, close the lid, and hope that your curiosity is aroused. I can recommend that you do some homework on that subject because it's very important. I can also recommend that you read a couple of very good books on the subject. To start off with, you might try Gary Allen's excellent little book called None Dare Call It Conspiracy, or Cleon Skousen's book, The Naked Capitalist. Or if you're really desperate, you might even try my own, called The Capitalist Conspiracy. And the story that you will put together very quickly is that there is a lot more going on at the United Nations and elsewhere in the world than communism. You will find that there is a parallel branch to the communist conspiracy, made up of the world's wealthiest men. And because they are so wealthy, many people mistakenly believe that they are capitalists. But the truth of the matter is that they're not capitalists at all. They're merely rich socialists. And their wealth and their prestige and their power is derived not from free enterprise or competition in the open market, but through government monopolies in business and commerce and through management of the money supplies. Political road to power and wealth, not the free enterprise road. And frankly, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't understand or are not aware of these two parallel branches of the same master conspiracy directing both of them, you will never be able to understand what's going on at the United Nations or over in Vietnam, or what's going on with inflation, our own money supply, or what's happening at the Supreme Court, or what's happening in the chaos on our streets. But we are talking here about the communist branch of that conspiracy and its control at the United Nations. Now, by 1952, the smell of communist penetration into the UN among the American employees there had become so strong that it became obvious that an investigation had to be carried out. And the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee conducted hearings entitled Activities of United States Citizens Employed by the United Nations. This is the testimony of high-ranking Americans at the UN Secretariat. These were not the girls that filed away the letters or waited table in the cafeteria or the janitors or anything like that. These were heads of departments. On page 181, it summarizes its findings as follows. Quote, extensive evidence indicating that there is today in the United Nations, among the American employees there, the greatest concentration of communists that this committee has ever encountered. End quote. Now that's quite a statement when you consider what committee is speaking, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and the concentration of communists that they have encountered, and yet this was the greatest of all. Well, people will tell you that things are better now. That was 1952, and they're much better now. Really? When did they get better? 11 of the worst offenders whose cases were brought out in these hearings, known in the American press at that time as the Red 11, were temporarily suspended from their jobs because they were such hot items, very controversial people. And then after the elections and all the smoke died down, everyone went back to sleep thinking that their newly elected leaders would take care of things. Here's how things got better. All 11 of those people were either rehired at their old jobs with back pay, or those which had already had other jobs in the meantime were given cash indemnities, some as high as $40,000 each. Now that's how things got better. Now, if things are even potentially that bad among the American quota to the UN, here we are, the most anti-communist nation in the world, you can imagine what it must be like among those people that go to the UN from such countries as Tanzania, Ghana, Egypt, the United Arab Republic, and many, many others. On December 12, 1952, U.S. News and World Report said, quote, U.S. authorities have no power to dig into the backgrounds of UN employees from other nations, although they have information indicating heavy communist infiltration among those employees. And informed estimates suggest that as many as 1/2 of the administrative executives in the UN are either communists or people who are willing to do what they want, end quote. Now, that was 1952, and I need not remind you that communist influence among the various nations in the world has not diminished since 1952. We hear a lot of talk about coalition governments and how bad they are. The primary reason being that somehow or other, every time we set up a coalition government with the communists in it, it always turns out eventually to produce a total communist regime. And so for that reason, many people are rightfully opposed to coalition governments. But I think we need to understand something about the mechanism of why they always turn out to be communist regimes. I urge you strongly, ladies and gentlemen, to spend about $1 altogether of your money and send in to the Superintendent of Documents in Washington and get 3 publications. The first one is a study of the Communist Party and coalition governments in the Soviet Union and in Eastern European countries. This is put out by the Library of Congress, and it's a case history review of how the tactic of coalition government was used in all of the Eastern European nations. The second one is entitled A Study of the Anatomy of Communist Takeovers. This is most revealing because it is prepared by the Assembly of Captive European Nations, and it consists of a series of articles or essays written by men who held key positions in those coalition governments. These were the non-communists who thought they could do business with the communists, make it work. These are the lucky ones who escaped with their lives and who are here telling us all about it and what went wrong. And then finally, the third is entitled The New Role of National Legislative Bodies in the Communist Conspiracy. And it is a reprint of 2 chapters taken out of a communist training manual used in Czechoslovakia to train communist cadre in the tactic of coalition government, written by Jan Kozak. Now, you put all those things together, those 3 documents together, and here is what you come up with. Here is the tactic of coalition government. First of all, the communists say that they must have, in the number 1 position in the government, called the president or the premier or whatever, they must have a non-communist. That's right, not a communist, a non-communist. The primary reason being that they don't want to alarm anybody. You see, if there were a communist at the head of these governments, many people would be upset. They would say, oh, wait a minute, we don't want to support that. What do you mean, a coalition? Well, look, there's a communist at the head of it. What kind of a coalition is that? And so they want a non-communist there. But not just any kind will do. A special kind, called a Marxist. Now, there is a difference. I know sometimes you hear, well, what's the difference between a Marxist and a communist? There is a major difference. A Marxist is a person who has read the writings of Karl Marx and believes it. But a communist is, by their own definition, a Marxist-Leninist. He is also a Marxist, but when you put the word Leninist after it, you are now describing a person who is adhering to the Communist Party created by Lenin and following the doctrine and the strategy and the tactics laid down by Lenin and subjecting himself to the discipline of the Communist Party itself. And so the communists say they don't want a Marxist-Leninist at the head of the government, they want just a Marxist because, first of all, it's deceptive coloration, because he looks like he's a non-communist, which indeed he is. But secondly, being a Marxist, he believes everything they do. He can't resist them. He'll promote almost everything they want. Now, the second job that they will negotiate for is usually called the Ministry of Information and or Education. They try for this job because they know that if they can get one of their people there, they can control the minds of the population merely by controlling the information and the education which they receive. Now, they will bargain for that. They don't always get it, but they usually do. But the third job they will not bargain for. They insist on it, and they always get it, and that is the job of the Ministry of the Interior. The Ministry of the Interior is the position which holds control over the police and the military. And if they can control that branch of government, which is in reality the force of government, then they've got it. They've really got the government. And the president or the premier can stand up there and issue proclamations until he's blue in the face. If they've got the military branch, they've got the government. And they can use that military branch, if necessary, to silence all opposition. Now, that is the tactic of coalition government. It's not very complicated. Now, the reason I've mentioned this is because if we take this blueprint of coalition government and lay it down over the blueprint of the United Nations as a template, the most interesting thing happens. Everything falls into place exactly. No deviation. It's a perfect pattern. What we find is that the United Nations is nothing more or less than a coalition government on the grand world stage. Who is the number one man at the United Nations, the fellow that holds the most conspicuous job of the Secretary General? Well, the first one was Trygve Lie. Was he a communist? Of course not. He was a Marxist. The second one was Dag Hammarskjöld, a Marxist. The third one was U Thant, a Marxist. The fourth, Kurt Waldheim, a Marxist. You might find it interesting to know, if you didn't pick this item up in your press already, that Waldheim was the first choice of the Soviet Union. And many people thought, well, isn't that generous of them, selecting a non-communist? And of course, they're merely following the classical strategy of coalition government. If you're interested about the Ministry of Information or Education at the United Nations, just spend an interesting afternoon sometime going through the list of UNESCO representatives. And you'll find that UNESCO is just riddled with communists from top to bottom, and those who are not communists are Marxists. But the important point here is the position of the Ministry of the Interior. At the United Nations, that position is called the Undersecretary General for Political and Security Council Affairs. The Undersecretary General for Political and Security Council Affairs is a civilian, just like our Secretary of Defense is a civilian. He is appointed by the Secretary General, just as our Secretary of Defense is appointed by the President. And he is in charge of the Military Staff Committee at the UN, just as our Secretary of Defense is in charge of the Chiefs of Staff. So the parallel is complete. The Undersecretary General has three primary areas of responsibility. 1, disarmament. 2, military activities. 3, atomic energy. Now, you add those three things up, and you are talking about a man who, in the not-too-distant future, if we carry out our own disarmament proposals and establish the kind of monopoly over world atomic weapons that we are proposing, you're talking about a man who may, in the not-too-distant future, hold in the palm of his hands absolute power of life or death over every man, woman, and child on the face of the planet. And I think for that reason we ought to be more than passingly curious as to who this fellow is. Well, here are their names. The one to hold that job first in 1945 was Arkady Sobolev, who was a communist from the Soviet Union. Number 2, Konstantin Zinchenko, a communist from the Soviet Union. 3, Ilya Chernychev. He was a communist from the Soviet Union. 4, Dragoslav Protic. Now, you're wrong. He was a communist from Yugoslavia. 5, Anatol Dobrynin. We're back to the Soviet Union again. Apparently they became distrustful of the Yugoslavs. 6, Georgy Arkadev, the Soviet Union. 7, Eugeny Kiselev, the Soviet Union. 8, Vladimir Suslov, the Soviet Union. 9, Alexei Nestorenko, the Soviet Union. And 10, Leonid Kudikov, a communist from the Soviet Union. Now, you will forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, but there's a line I like to throw in here, and I can't resist it. Some of us extremists have come to the wild-eyed conclusion that 10 out of 10 represents a trend of sorts. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it is obvious that we are going to have not only a world dictatorship, but the control of that dictatorship is going to fall into the hands of communism through the tactic of coalition government, which has never failed them in the past. This, then, is the case against the United Nations. 1, the United Nations is destructive of human rights. 2, the United Nations creates conditions that lead to war. 3, if allowed to continue, the United Nations inevitably will develop into a world socialist dictatorship. And 4, final control of that dictatorship will come to rest in the hands of international communism. So what are we going to do about it? The first thing we have to face squarely is the fact that the United Nations cannot be changed. You always hear somebody say, well, let's stay in the organization, let's not be rash. Let's exert our leadership. Let's not abandon that organization to the communists. That's what they say. Show them, who can be boss. That reminds me of the story of the woman that was chasing her husband around the house with a rolling pin. And he made it just in time to those ladder stairs that go up into the attic, and he got up there and he was sitting on the lid all out of breath, and she was down below banging on the lid with her rolling pin, and she yelled up, she said, "Henry, you come down here this minute." And he yelled down in a big, strong, masculine voice, he said, "I will not. I'll show you who's boss around here." That's about as much chance as we have of showing anybody who's boss at the United Nations. They've got the rolling pin. It's their organization. We can't change it, primarily because any substantial change on behalf of America or on behalf of freedom, any place in the world, would have to be incorporated through substantial charter amendments. And as everyone knows, these are subject to veto by the Soviet Union and now Red China also. So it can't be changed. Let's quit talking about it as though it could be. Somebody always comes along with a weak voice and said, well, but wait a minute, what would you replace it with? How many times have we heard that? Can you imagine a woman going to her doctor and she says, "Doctor, I've got a lump in my side and it hurts a little bit now." So he examines her and he says, "Madam, you have a tumor. I suggest that the first thing we do in the morning is get you to the hospital and take that out." Can you picture her turning around and saying, "But wait a minute, doctor, what would you replace it with?" It's absurd. Of course not. If just one of those charges which I have made here, if just one of them is true, then the United Nations is indeed like a cancer, and just getting rid of it is a step in the right direction. We don't have to replace it with anything. But in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to suggest a counter thought to that. The United Nations not only could be replaced, doesn't have to be, but it could be replaced, and perhaps should be replaced, by an international community or federation of nations based on the exact opposite of the United Nations on almost every significant point. I would like to leave you with this suggestion. Instead of diplomacy on the stage, what I think we need is quiet diplomacy, statesmanship without propaganda or fanfare. Instead of the concept of unlimited government power to cram everybody into the same mold, what we need is to create a respect for the value of no power at all internationally to coerce either men or nations. A new thought to many people: no power at all to coerce anyone. Instead of international armies and machines of war, we must promote the spirit of tolerance, compassion, and above all, persuasion by example. Instead of erecting new international trade barriers, tariffs, sanctions, blockades, and embargoes, we must have a reduction of even the existing government restrictions on world trade. Instead of meaningless rhetoric about human rights, we must have a recognition of the divine origin of those rights. And then we must have ironclad guarantees with no exception, especially as may be provided by law. Instead of a world money without value, monopolized by a World Bank without integrity, we must have a return to the gold standard and the freedom to hold or exchange any national currency on the basis of its intrinsic merit. Instead of gathering control of all the weapons and armies of the world into one place, where they could be used to quell any resistance to a world police state, we must ensure the decentralization of military might as widely as possible, and the preservation of all national defense capabilities to whatever degree is necessary to make an attack unprofitable. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the difference between the dream and the reality is that instead of a UN cabal of dictators and bureaucrats carrying out the directives of a ruthless and power-hungry conspiracy, the world needs, more desperately now than ever before, a true Parliament of Man, responsive to the needs of all mankind. And to that end, we ask your help. Thank you.